Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I am here with my December wrap-up. The first book I picked up in December was a novella, and that was The Sears Choice by J. Kathleen Cheney. This takes place in the world of the Golden City series, and it's a fantasy Portugal series set during the early 1900s, I think. There's a lot of political intrigue and mystery, and the most interesting part is that there are several other races of essentially mer people that sort of live and coexist to an extent with the humans of this world. This novella, we follow two minor characters from the series, and they are Genoveva and Raphael, and I really enjoyed this story. I was really surprised at how quickly I became attached to them because it is such a short book. And I really loved how the romantic relationship developed between these two, even though I was a little concerned about insta-love at one point, because Raphael's gift or talent is that he can sort of predict things that are going to happen in the future with some limitations. And he knew that he was going to marry Genoveva. And somehow, even with him knowing that, their romance never really felt forced, and I actually really enjoyed both of them as characters. The plot itself was sort of mediocre at best. It mainly seemed like an excuse to get Raphael and Genoveva together, but I didn't really mind it because I was enjoying both characters so much. I'm not sure you could read this as a standalone, but as part of the larger Golden City series, which is a trilogy, plus this novella, I definitely recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars. The next book I finished was Daughter of the Pirate King by Trisha Levenseller. This book was getting a lot of hype on BookTube recently, and a lot of people really enjoyed it, and unfortunately I was really disappointed in this book. I did think that the plot itself and sort of the setup for the story is really interesting. We follow Alosa, who is the daughter of the Pirate King, and she is supposed to be this very fearsome pirate in her own right, and at the beginning of the novel she sets up her own capture by this other group of pirates. And she deliberately gets caught so that she can search their ship for something important that she needs. So she's supposed to be this mastermind, basically, and very talented and a brilliant fighter and strategist. And therein lies my main problem with this book. Alosa was really none of those things, at least not consistently. It felt like her abilities and personality would change every time the plot required it. And even though I understand that she was holding back on some of her fighting abilities so that she could lure her captors into this false sense of security, that didn't really explain everything, because it's like we're supposed to believe she's this amazing, like, kick-ass fighter who could defeat anyone with both hands tied behind her back. So we go from that kind of situation where she easily defeats her attackers to being in a position where the love interest can suddenly sneak up on her and she has no idea. And she's clearly supposed to be very good at stealth and fighting and basically everything else. She's just incredibly gifted at it, until the plot needs her not to be. And I just didn't like that. And I also felt that the romance was pretty disappointing, and I think I would have enjoyed this more if I hadn't had such high expectations, but you know, as it was, I don't think it lived up to the hype, and I gave this 2.5 stars. Next, I picked up The Kiss of Deception by Mary E. Pearson. This is the first book in a fantasy trilogy called The Remnant Chronicles, and we follow our main character, Leah, who is a princess, and she runs away before her wedding because she decided that she didn't want to get married to this heir of another kingdom. And she runs away to this little seaside town where she becomes a waitress, and she stays there for a very long time. And we're sort of following the consequences of those decisions. So I'll start with the things that I enjoyed about this book. I really liked the setting and some of the world building elements, particularly the religion and mythology of this world and the kind of cultural background, like the allusions we get to another society in the past I thought were really interesting. I really liked Pauline, Leah's maid and sort of best friend, I guess. I thought she was a really interesting character. It was great to see some female friendship in this book. And I also, for the most part, enjoyed the writing style. The first chapter or so especially were really fantastically written, and actually that preview was what made me order the whole trilogy. There were a lot more things that I didn't enjoy about this book. And one of them, I will be upfront and say that it's a personal preference thing for me, and that is this whole, like, running away from your wedding thing that is sort of becoming a trope in YA fantasy. I feel like if a character is going to make that decision to break off this possibly very important alliance with a neighboring kingdom who could invade your kingdom if you upset them, if you're going to make that decision, you have to make it believable for why that fate is so awful that you would put this entire country of your citizens in danger. And I don't think Leah did that. She came off as very selfish and immature, and then she was surprised when her actions had consequences for other people, especially when they were people that she knew. And that just kind of drove me crazy throughout this book, is Leah was astonished every time she made a choice that would affect a bunch of people and their happiness, and then it happened and she was surprised. There's a quote that really sums up how I feel about her. That at one point, one of the other characters in the story tells her to pull your royal head out of your ass and get used to it. And amen. I also really didn't like the love triangle. I thought that whole, like, you don't know which boy character is the assassin and which one is the prince, I thought that was pretty gimmicky, and it made character development really difficult. So I gave this book 3 stars, and the reason I did not give it 2 is because there is one decision Leah makes at the very end of this book that made me respect her and gave me hope for her as a character in the coming books. So, holding out hope. Next, I finished The Secret Horses of Briar Hill by Megan Shepherd. This is sort of a historical fiction slash fantasy. I guess you could call it magical realism. I'm not really sure. It's set during World War II in a children's hospital, or a palace that has been converted into a children's hospital. And it's just really, it's charming without being overly sweet. And there's a lot of darkness in this book that I wasn't necessarily expecting going in. And I really loved our main character and the way she saw the world, because I feel like Megan Shepherd did a great job of making her young protagonist interesting to older readers while still reminding us of some of the ways that we thought when we were that age, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed it. I rounded it up from 3.5 stars to 4 stars just because of the emotional impact this book had on me that I wasn't expecting. Next, I finished Graceling by Kristen Kishore, and this is the first book in a companion trilogy, and I will be doing a full review on this book very soon, so keep an eye out for that. But I loved this book. In this world, there are people who are gifted with certain abilities. Some of them are stronger than others, and these people are called the Graced, or Gracelings. And Katza, our main character, is graced with the ability to kill. She is an incredible fighter, and she's basically kept as the king's guard dog and executioner, and we follow her as she comes to terms with her abilities and starts to unravel this mystery about the kingdom, along with another character named Poe. So I loved Katza as a main character. She was fierce and battle-hardened in believable ways, I think, and even that being said, she was never reduced to like a fighting, killing robot or anything. Like, she still had emotional reactions to things, and they were sometimes stunted because of the way she had grown up and this awful environment she was in. But she always felt like a fully developed character, and I absolutely adored her relationship with Poe, like her friendship and their eventual romance, and it was just so wonderful. Like, I loved Poe as a character too. I highly, highly recommend this book. It was my favorite of the month, and I gave it 5 stars. Next book I picked up was The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. So this is a retelling of the Vasilisa the Beautiful story. This is the first book I read from my 5-star TBR predictions, so obviously I was hoping and expecting to love this one. And overall, I really did. I thought the setting and the atmosphere were just so great, and the writing really worked well with that. It felt very old world fairy tale, and I loved that aspect of it. I ended up giving this book 4 stars because there were a couple of things that I didn't love about this book, and one of them is kind of a big one. The smaller problem I had was related to the characters. At the beginning of the book, we get to know one of the characters who will eventually become kind of like one of the villains, or like the evil stepmother of the Vasilisa story, and she was super interesting, and I really enjoyed getting to see, you know, how she grew up and why that kind of made her the person she was. And she was just a very interesting character, set up to be a very empathetic villain, I think. And then, as soon as she comes into the main plot of the story, we just sort of abandon her point of view altogether, especially the sympathetic parts. And I just thought that was kind of weird that we would spend so much time getting attached to her, or at least being interested in what happened to her, and then just turn her into a generic villain. So I didn't love that, and I also felt that Vasya, or Vasilisa, as a main character was just kind of okay. Things that happened to her were really interesting, but as a character, she felt sort of a little bit generic sometimes. Like, there were multiple times where I could kind of predict all of her character traits, because she's like that very standard, like, fairy tale heroine slash strong fantasy girl heroine, where it's like, alright, I bet she's gonna be great with horses. And she was. Then like, oh, I bet she's gonna be described as really plain compared to her sisters, but somehow everyone is struck by her interesting face, and like she was. And those were just little things that overall didn't bother me that much, but that's something to keep in mind. The main thing that bothered me about this book is that throughout the entire story, the plot only happens because every single character in this book makes decisions that they know are stupid over and over and over again. And even Vasya, who is supposed to be more well-versed in these like folklore stories and how to handle these things, even Vasya occasionally will do that when it's necessary for the plot. And I just think I would have enjoyed this book a lot more if Catherine Arden had, rather than letting the reader know that all of the characters are doing things wrong and that's why all these bad things are going to happen, and like sort of building the suspense that way because we're going crazy waiting for them to figure out what we already know, if instead of doing that, she had built that suspense through the reader not knowing if the characters were making the right decision. I don't know if that makes any sense. That's the main reason why I gave this book 4 stars instead of 5, but almost everything else I loved about it. Writing, story, retelling aspects were all really great, and I'm really looking forward to the second book because I think there's going to be a lot more like court politics and things like that, and I think that the issues I had with the first book are not going to come into the second one. So, really excited. Next, I finished Romancing the Duke by Tessa Dare, and this is a historical romance novel. It's the first in a kind of companion series, and basically our main character, Izzy Goodnight, has a father who was well known for this series of fairy tale bedtime stories. And he passes away. She is left penniless and with no one to go to for help. And then she is left a castle by this mysterious, I think, uncle or godfather or something in his will. And she decides to live there and start her own life. She's very independent and intelligent. And she gets there and finds out that the Duke who was living there is actually still living there. And this situation becomes even more complicated because this Duke is blind. Of course, he doesn't really want to leave his environment that he is familiar with. Feelings between the two develop from there, and that's the book. I did like Izzy as the main character. She was really funny and strong and interesting, and she also had that kind of sense of romance that she hadn't lost from when she was a young girl, and I just really liked her, so that was really fun. But one of the big issues is that I did not like the male love interest at all. I am not really into that whole like alpha male, like he's really, like he acts like a brute, but you know, deep underneath he cares and he has this heart of gold that he's hiding under this like womanizing, misogynistic, possibly abusive exterior. I'm not really into that, and that's kind of what this felt like to me, at least for a good portion of the book. And you know, when it's a romance novel that you don't like the romance in, it's not a very enjoyable experience. So I will not be continuing with these books. I know a lot of people love them, and I'm glad you did, and I gave this book 2.5 stars. The next book I finished in December was An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is a story that is set on a town on the border of fairyland, and our main character, Isabel, is a painter, and the fae in this world are unable to create human art or craft, so they value it very highly in certain artists who are human. What kicks the story off is Isabel painting human emotion into the eyes of one of her portrait sitters, who turns out to be a prince, and that could cost him his throne, and he decides to drag her into Fairy to stand trial for her crimes. And all of these adventures kick off from there, and romance ensues, adventuring, all of that good stuff. So I really enjoyed the setting and the writing of this story, and Isabel as a main character was okay. The romance felt a little bit like insta-love, but it didn't bother me as much as in some books because I really liked Rook myself, so it didn't seem as bad because I was also interested in this character as quickly as our protagonist was, so that was kind of okay. I also really enjoyed a couple of the side characters in this book, and I wish that we had gotten to see more of them. Even though I liked Rook as the Autumn Prince, and I really enjoyed the cast of fairies overall, like the way that they're beautiful and enchanting, but just a little bit wrong, and they're dangerous, but you are still entranced by them. Like, I really liked all of that. But I would have liked to explore more about the fairies backgrounds, like what made Rook special and kind of why he was the first one to get into this particular situation that we follow in the book. And just there were a lot of little threads like that that I felt weren't tied up. Finally, this book just felt sort of choppy to me. I feel like this book was split into 4 distinct parts that didn't have much to do with each other, or we would suddenly move very quickly from one plot element to another and it was kind of jarring. But overall, I still gave this book 3.5 stars because there was something about this fairy world that I did enjoy. Like, I did want to come back to it, and the descriptions of the seasons' kingdoms in particular were just so beautiful, and I think one of the big reasons that I ended up enjoying this book as much as I did. Next, I finally picked up my first Adam Silvera book, and that was They Both Die at the End. I'm sure you know the synopsis of this one. It's set in a world where people get a phone call on the day they're going to die, and our 2 main characters, Rufus and Mateo, find each other through this Last Friend app so that they don't spend their last day alone, and it's just them going on adventures and getting to know and care about each other, and it was wonderful. I really enjoyed this book. I really liked the fantastical or like science fiction elements of this book, like the death cast system in particular, and I kind of liked that it wasn't explained. We didn't waste any page space on getting into this science fiction world. One of my favorite parts of this book were the chapters that we got from other characters that were not central to Rufus and Mateo's story. I just loved the feeling that those gave us, that just because somebody is not the protagonist of a story, it doesn't mean you don't have your own story. You know, it was like everybody's an important character. I will say, like, I didn't cry at the end of this book, and that was really surprising to me. Maybe it's because I was prepared for how sad this book was going to be. It's called They Both Die at the End, so I was sort of expecting to be like emotionally gutted, and I kind of wasn't. And I think part of the reason is one of the only critiques of this book I have, and that is Adam Silvera's writing style is really enjoyable and quick to read, but it's sort of distancing, which is strange for this kind of book. And he also had this tendency when writing to go back and forth between these like philosophical mental wanderings and then something funny about what's happening, like really quickly. And although that kind of broke up the sad bits, which I appreciated, I do think that that was part of the reason why I didn't connect emotionally with this book as much as some people did. But all that being said, I did still really enjoy this. I understand why people love Adam Silvera and why they let him torture them with his novels, and I gave it 4 stars. And finally, the last book I finished in December was Fire by Kristen Kishore. And this is actually a prequel to the events of Graceling. We follow our main character, Fire, who lives in a kingdom called the Dells, and some of the creatures in the Dells are known as monsters, and they have brilliantly colored hair and eyes and sometimes skin or fur, depending on what they are. And they're incredibly dangerous. People are attracted to them and entranced by them, but they can be lethal. And Fire is the last remaining human monster in this world. And in this book there is even more political intrigue than in Graceling, and there's a lot more negotiation and sort of political maneuvering and all of that, rather than like a mystery or adventure like in Graceling. And I didn't love this book quite as much as Graceling, but I did still really enjoy it. I liked Fire as a main character, and I really liked her love interest too, because they were so well suited to each other. And I also loved being in the world of the Dells. It was exciting and interesting to be in a world near that of the Gracelings, but one that was just completely different. This book did sometimes feel a little bit too long. Like, there was this section in the middle that was basically, it pretty much just seemed like it existed to justify the villain of the first book, and I felt like we really didn't need that bit. It kind of dragged down the story for me, but other than that, I did really enjoy this book, and I also just loved the great discussion of the power of women that we are getting in Fire, but also in Graceling. I just really love how Kristen Kishore tackles gender roles in a fantasy setting. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I'm really looking forward to reading Bitter Blue. Okay everybody, so those are the books that I finished in December. I finished 10 books during the month, and my average rating was around a 3.6 or 3.7, I think, which is pretty good for me. I had a couple of duds, but overall I enjoyed most of the books I read. Definitely let me know down below in the comments if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them, and let me know what your favorite book you read in December was. I know we are like halfway through January, but I'm still curious. I will see you guys soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!